Hi there, my name is Will and I'm going to walk you through how you can run certain parts of your workflow using inputs. Now sometimes it can be quite useful to be able to only run certain parts of your workflow by using inputs. Now I'm going to run you through a few examples of how we can block that together so that you can choose what runs and when at execution, and a few new things to make that even easier in Kestra 0.20. Now here I have a workflow that has a simple input here, just simply a boolean, and we're going to use this boolean to basically determine whether we should run the whole workflow or only a part of it. Now, I've got two separate log tasks here. This first one will be always run. As we can see here, it says this will always run. So that's very clear. But we want to set it so that step 2 only runs if the boolean is set to true. Now, traditionally, we could do this using an if statement. So we can add that in here, and that is really useful if you want to be able to add multiple tasks and chain them together to run when a certain condition is met. So let's add that in. And for this condition property, I'm simply just going to set it to the input. So as you can see here, the input is a boolean, so this will just return true or false. I don't need to put equals true, but you can do that if you want to. And then I simply need to just add in here the one task under the then statement here to run this. So if I now run this and set the input to false, we can see here it ran the if statement, but the condition meant that the later task didn't run. But I can now set that to true, and we can see here that it is going to run, and it is going to run step 2 as well because we set that to true. Now, in Kestra 0.20, we've added a new property called runIf, which is really helpful because adding all of this boilerplate workflow YAML is a bit annoying for running one simple task. Now, we can get rid of all of this, and I can now format this to be like it was as a normal task, but I can simply now add to any task this simple runIf property, and then we can just add our input here. So now, if I just put run everything down here, this is a lot easier to do, and it means that you can have this in multiple places without having to add loads of if statements to your workflow. So now, if I press run if everything if true, we'll see that it does run this task. But if I run it again and I set it to false, we'll see that it says it was skipped. So slightly different in the execution logs to previously, but the output is the same. And as we can see here, I've added both of these examples now to our workflow. And as we can see here, step 2 has a task condition, which we can see is defined here. And as we can see, step 3 is an if statement. So as we can see, it's inside of this whole little block here. Super useful if I wanted to add maybe a step 4 as well. So to summarize, runIf is super useful if you want to be able to specify individual tasks to run on individual conditions. As soon as you want to start running multiple tasks on the same condition at the same time, then you should use an if statement like we have here. As you can see here, I've got 2 tasks here, and we can see it's visualized here really nicely in the topology view. Here I've got another example. Here I have a number of different inputs. Here I can specify whether I want to get outputs, whether I want to generate a CSV file, and whether I want to upload. And I'm able to use conditional inputs here to be able to basically specify that I won't be able to upload something if I don't generate a file to upload. So we can see that here in action, that if CSV is set to false, we don't see it. But if I set it to true, I now get an additional option. So this is a nice way of being able to break up your workflow to be able to control exactly what part of it you would like to run using inputs. Now, if we have a look at the code here, we are running Python to begin with, and I'm able to use those expressions directly inside of the Python code to determine whether certain bits should run. So as we can see here, I'm saying inputs.outputs, which is the name of our input here. If that is set to true, then it's going to generate outputs that we can then view in the logs. And the same for CSV. If that's set to true, then it will generate us a CSV file. Now, just because it generated a CSV file doesn't necessarily mean we want to upload that to S3. And so I'm able to use that brand new runIf property in Kestra 0.20 using it inside of the S3 upload task. And this just now really cleans this up and makes it much easier to use. So now when I press execute, we can see here, I can say yes to exporting the CSV, but false to the S3. And when I execute this, we'll see that Python's going to run, and we'll see that S3 will get skipped. So as we can see here, the code ran no problem. And we can see that the S3 upload was skipped. Now we can double check our inputs here. We can see that CSV was true, Upload was false, but outputs was true. So now if we go to outputs, we'll be able to see that we do have an output file with the data that we were expecting inside of it. We also have our output values too. So we can see the large, small, and medium were sent to Kestra from our code. But if I execute this again and say, do not generate the outputs, but do generate the CSV file, we'll see the same response where it's going to run our code, it's going to skip the S3 upload, and it's going to skip actually generating those outputs. So as you can see here, no output values are available. In my final example here, we have a number of different inputs here for a PR if true workflow. What this workflow is going to do is it's going to ask if we want to push our flows and namespace files to our GitHub repository, and if we want to create a pull request. Now, we don't want to create a pull request if we don't end up pushing anything to GitHub, because then we won't have anything in our branch to create a pull request from. So we can use conditional inputs again here to check whether either or of those are set to true. So here in our workflow, we've got a task here that will push our flows, and it's using that runIf property here to prevent us having an if statement just for one task. Same for the namespace files task, except for when we're using a different input here. And then the same for the pull request one. And then because we're using conditional inputs, we can then specify that the PR will only be created if we've actually given it the option. It will only let us even select that as an option if we push something via the flows or namespace files. So as we can see here, these are both set to true by default. But if I set this to false and this one to false, we can see that the PR one disappears. And as we can see when I execute this workflow, it's going to push our flows, but it's going to not push our namespace files or the PR, but we can see that it did officially skip those, which is quite useful for being able to revisit in the execution logs. Now, one other thing to bear in mind as well is you can then have these inputs so that when you manually make an execution for whatever reason, that you can specify to only run a certain bit, because maybe you're running it manually because something didn't work. But you can have your trigger at the bottom here have different inputs so that it will always run a certain thing. So for example, you might want it so that your trigger is always running, pushing the flows, pushing the namespace files, and creating a PR. But you might want to just periodically push your changes, but you're not ready to merge them yet. So we can see here using the inputs property. So as we can see here, I've set the flows and namespace files to both be true. So we can make sure those are being pushed regularly, but I have to manually create a pull request, for example. And that is the flexibility that you get using these inputs to be able to decide what parts of your workflow run. Hopefully you found that useful, and you're going to be able to start creating your workflows to be modular so that you can run them in chunks. Let us know in the comments below how you're going to run your workflows using this new methodology, and if you're going to use the new runIf task in Kestra 0.20. Make sure to join our Slack community, which you can find in the description below, and give us a start on GitHub.